rather steep angle of 19 degrees. This causes some problems and it solves some problems. By angling the 12-inch belt at 19 degrees, you're basically giving it an equivalent thickness of 13.5 to 14 inches against relatively flat trajectory shots, which is good. You're using less armor to have greater equivalent thickness. You're saving weight. These ships were designed to a treaty limit, and Congress mandated the cost of these ships. The problem is, you've got something straight up and down that's only as tall as your hull. In our case, about 50 or 60 feet tall, if you're doing the whole side of the ship, and you tend not to with an armored belt. When you angle it, to cover that same 50 or 60 feet, you now need 70, 80, 90 feet of armor. So the trick is to get an angle that'll both defeat shots but not add more length, so that the weight of it ends up being even more than your just solid, thick piece of armor. Next, you've got laminating multiple layers together. If you were to take, say, a 3-inch armored deck and then try and put 2 more inches on top of it, you've got 5 inches of armor, right? Wrong. It's not the same equivalent thickness. It maybe only has the same equivalent thickness of 3.5 or 4 inches of armor. And there's a formula to figure that out that engineers and people who do the maths know. So, for example, the pre-treaty dreadnoughts that different countries saved were allowed to use 3,000 tons to add more armor to their decks and more torpedo protection. Just adding new layers on top of old layers wasn't very effective. Likewise, if you were to have your layer of steel and then have a gap and then another layer of steel, that is a little bit better than if you just lay 2 inches on top of 3 inches, but it's still not quite there. So it was determined that if you were to have a little bit of steel, a gap, heavy layer of steel, and then a thin layer added onto that, you have a greater equivalent thickness than the individual thicknesses added together. So in some places on the ship, that was used. Now, it's worth mentioning that as great as I say Isle-class armor is, it was very much a compromise. It was the lowest priority of the designers. They basically took the armor scheme from the previous South Dakota class, which, while good, is not best. Because the armored belt is on the inside, you've got to launch your ships at a heavier displacement, which means you need stronger building ways. So New Jersey's building ways had to be modified before she could be built there. It required an additional expenditure. Also, because it's on the inside, if it takes damage, then it's real hard to repair. You've got to cut away the exterior plates to get to the armor plate. And third, the actual shell plating of the ship isn't armored. A destroyer with 5-inch guns can punch a ton of holes in the side of this ship and cause extensive flooding, maybe even enough to compromise our torpedo defense system. And without penetrating the armored citadel of the ship, will affect the ship's ability to float. And that's not even fighting a full-on battleship. So, internal armor belts were not preferred. Also, the armored belt forms part of the torpedo defense system. The armored belt is rigid, whereas the torpedo defense system should be able to absorb an impact and bend. And with an angled belt that is directing the explosion downwards towards where the angled belt meets the bottom of the ship, which is the thinnest and weakest connection. So if a torpedo explosion reaches that rigid belt armor, one, it's going to shear where the thin part of the belt armor meets up with the thick part of the belt armor and make a big hole up there. And two, it's going to be directed downwards and shear where it meets the bottom of the ship and create a hole there. And so your system is effectively defeated. So Montana, which was closer to the ideal, the class of battleships coming after Iowa, had an external belt. It was still angled for greater equivalent thickness, but it was mounted on the outside of the ship. And the belt didn't go all the way to the bottom of the ship. They had an external belt, and they had more belt armor inside that overlapped some, but formed part of the torpedo bulkhead. By removing this, it meant when a torpedo hit, it wasn't going to rip away there. So it's already there, forming an armored bulkhead. So that's what the Navy really preferred to do if they could. So these ships are very much a compromise. But all battleships are compromises. On this channel before, I've talked about Arizona. She's armed with 14-inch guns, so she's armored against 14-inch guns. The problem was the bombs used during the attack on Pearl Harbor by the level bombers, the Kings, were modified 16.1-inch naval shells. The battleships Nagato and Mutsu used these types of shells, and the Japanese had enough of them laying around. They modified some into aerial bombs. So effectively, Arizona, with armor to stop 14-inch shells, was hit by a 16-inch shell. That overmatches her armor, is able to reach a magazine, and destroy the ship. In some of our ship comparison videos, we talk about Hood and Bismarck's armor schemes. They both use a much older World War I style scheme. And both of these schemes are pretty good for close-in fighting, but not very good against plunging fire. So be sure to watch those videos and see how those ships fared. They both use something interesting, which is a turtle deck design. So they've got their belt armor, and then they've got an angled deck and a flat deck. So a projectile coming into the belt armor not only has to defeat that, but then it has to defeat the turtle deck to get into the engineering spaces. Pretty difficult. However, it's really easy for plunging fire to go over the belt and defeat that system. I'd be remiss in talking about armor if I didn't mention the Japanese battleship Yamato, which is the most heavily armored battleship ever. Although I think Bismarck devotes a higher percentage of her total displacement to armor. Bismarck does not use the all-or-nothing system effectively. She uses a World War I system. Yamato uses more of an all-or-nothing system and has armor plate up to 24 inches thick to protect against her own size 18-inch guns. The U.S. Navy did have a prototype 18-inch gun, and there were discussions with both the Iowa and the Montana class designs to install that type of gun. Ended up not happening. It ended up taking a massive amount of punishment to sink Yamato and Musashi. Their armor wasn't perfect. There were failures in the torpedo defense that led to their loss, but with the number of projectiles thrown against them, there really wasn't any way to save those ships. They remain the most armored ships ever, and possibly the only battleships ever built that could have withstood New Jersey's own guns. However, following World War II, the various navies of the world basically stopped armoring their ships. The invention of missiles being able to hit at long ranges has led to no desire to armor ships. Armor is expensive, it makes your ships heavy. If you're making your ships heavier, it takes more propulsive equipment to make them go faster, which makes your ship longer, which means you need more armor, which makes your ship heavier. So it becomes a self-perpetuating issue. Speed and ability to respond to crises around the world means you want a fast ship. But in order to be able to manufacture enough ships to go around the world to respond to all these crises, you need them to be light and cheap. And so with the end of World War II and the end of colonial spheres of influences, you're no longer protecting your own zone with armored battle fleet. You're now going out into other people's countries all over the world with fast, light ships. And so the use of armor in ships has fallen away. There has been some extremely interesting developments in tank armor using reactive systems, ceramic systems, and of course also in tank